Sitemaps are just as important as ever to make sure that you're communicating your website's content to the web. In long live RSS feeds, there's still a lot of valid use cases beyond feed readers, whether you're using Zapier or Pipedream to automate some of your workflows, or maybe you're using it programmatically inside of your applications. But regardless of the use case, Next.js traditionally didn't really make it easy to be able to provide this capability, where you had to use some kind of hacky workflow to get there. But that's all changed with the Next.js App Router, which gives us a lot of capabilities for generating those static files programmatically. So let's see how we can build our sitemap and other static files like RSS feeds inside Next.js. To see how this works, I'm going to be working out of my Next.js WordPress starter, which I've begun migrating over to the App Router. One of the things that I had to do in the previous iteration is manually generate this file using all my site content. To make this work, I kind of set up a Webpack plugin where it's just the mechanism that triggers the event so that it actually grabs all the data and compiles out that XML file. I had it hooked into the nextconfig.js file along with some other things, including that RSS feed, as well as an index for my search. But now I want to recreate it inside of the Next.js App Router, and it's so much easier to build that sitemap file with the new API. Now, I don't want to statically include all these different files, so what I want to do is generate that file. And the way I can set that up is by starting adding my sitemap.js or TS if you're using TypeScript right inside of that app directory. So inside of my app directory, I'm going to create that new file of sitemap.js. But the first thing I'm going to do is export a default async function called sitemap. And ultimately, I'm going to return an array that's going to include all the different pages I want to include. Now that syntax is going to be my object where I include my URL, where I can paste in my Next.js WordPress starter, which ideally I could get dynamically, but let's just leave it out there for now. But then I want to also include a last modified, which is going to be the last time that that content was updated. And we can just use something for the homepage like new date. But now let's check up our progress on this, where literally all we're doing right now is defining a default async function of sitemap, and we're returning an array with our homepage. If I now go to localhost 3000/sitemap.xml, we can see that I now, just as simple as that, have my new sitemap. Now, the nice thing about defining this as an async function is now I can actually make requests inside. So I'm going to import this function where I can run get all posts and get them all inside of an array. Now, once I have that request being made and I have access to all those posts, all I need to do now is actually format that where I can create my constant of posts, where I can map through all of my posts. And for each of those posts, I ultimately want to return that URL in the last modified, where in my case, I want to set this up and I'm going to use a template literal tag so that I can make this actually dynamic, but it's going to be my posts.uri. It looks like I actually need to make that post, not post, to make sure it's that single instance. And my last modified date is actually already going to be available under post.modified. Now, it's probably best to make sure that you're including a full URL for the actual URL. In my case, I'm going to reach out to WordPress using WP GraphQL and actually get that URL that's going to be the public-facing site. So in front of my URI, I'm also going to include metadata.url, which will give me that fully formatted URL. But ultimately, with that formatted, I can now just simply spread out all those posts into my returned array. And once I refresh the page, we can see that I have not only my homepage, but I have all those posts being dynamically pulled in from my existing functions that request that data for me. Now, the sitemap having first-class support makes it really nice and easy for being able to just simply dump all this content inside an XML file, make sure that Next.js is handling all the cache for us, and there's really not much more we need to do beyond that. But when it comes to the RSS feeds or other types of feeds, there's not a first-class way like sitemaps to do that, but instead we can use static route handlers, which will allow us to really build whatever file we want in that static way. Now, to do this, the way we need to set it up is under our app directory. We want to define the route of where we want that to be, and then include our route.js or TS file inside, which will include that logic, including our get request for defining that file output. So back inside of my app directory, I'm going to create a new directory called feed.xml. And inside that folder, I'm going to create a new file route.js. Inside, I'm going to export an async function called get, where inside I'm ultimately going to do the same thing I did for my sitemap, but just be a little bit more manual for how I handle the response. So I'm going to actually copy a lot of this over where I'm going to get my metadata and all of the posts. But ultimately, the way that we respond to this request is going to be different than how we responded with an array with our sitemap. First of all, we need to actually create an RSS feed or manually create that XML to return in that response. Now, technically, we could probably do that all with some template literal tags where we actually stuff our data inside, but that's a little bit messy in my opinion to actually have to manage. So instead, I'm going to use an npm library to handle that. Particularly, I'm going to use Node RSS, which is a little bit old, but it does a really good job for being able to easily set up a new RSS feed. So inside my terminal, I'm going to run npm install RSS. And inside of my project, I'm going to import RSS from the RSS package. And then I'm going to start off by creating a constant of feed and set that equal to a new instance of RSS. Where inside, I'm going to start setting up all the different fields that I want to include in the RSS, including my title, of course, which in my instance, I'm able to easily get from my site metadata. So I'm going to include my metadata.title, as well as my description, which are actually coming directly from WordPress. And then I'm going to copy and paste a few more fields in there, including my site URL, feed URL, a copyright statement, the language, which again is coming from WordPress, as well as a pub date, which is going to be just when this actual RSS feed was published, which in this case, I'm just going to use new date. But now before we start adding our posts, let's just double check that this is working. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to return a new response where we're going to ultimately pass through our content, but we want to also set up our response where because we're creating an RSS feed, we want to make sure we're setting up the right content headers. So I'm going to paste this in, which I'm going to set my content type of application Atom XML with my charset of UTF-8. But the important part is this actual content. And the way that we can do this is by passing through our feed, but we're going to chain on the XML method. So now if we go to the browser and instead try to load feed.xml, we can see that we now get this RSS feed easily generated with all these details that we added inside. So now let's actually start adding all of our posts. For every post that we have, we want to ultimately use the feed.item method. So the way that I'm going to handle that is I'm going to run all posts for each post. I'm going to ultimately run that feed.item. And just like the top level RSS feed itself, we're going to have a few things that we need to pass in, including the title, which I can get from post.title. But I'm going to paste in the rest of my specific fields where we have a lot of important fields that we want to make sure we're including here, including our GUID, our URL, our date. You can even include a description and the categories, but we want to make sure that we have some of these top level important ones so that anything that's trying to read our feed is able to do it in a valid way. While you're building this, if you want to make sure that your feed is valid after you deploy it because it needs to be publicly available, or if you use direct input, you can use this W3C feed validation service, which you can find by just simply Googling for RSS feed validator, or I'll include the link in the description. But now let's actually test this out, where if I save it and reload the page, we can see that we get all that content in, including having an item for each and every one of those posts. But if I even wanted to check to make sure that this is valid, I can go ahead and copy the source from this, head over to that service, go to direct input and paste it in, and make sure that I remove any white space in front of it. And then I click check, and we can see that it is successfully valid. The nice thing is we can really extend this static route handling to any situation we want, whether it is our feeds. Or maybe if we wanted to create an index of all of our posts and create some kind of easy to use search index, we can create a search.json file, include our route.js. We can grab all those posts and format it with only the data that we want. And we can even use the next response helper here from Next server, including that JSON method to pass back our data. Or now if I, instead of feed.xml, go to search.json, we can see I have all the data I need to be consumed however I want. The Next.js App Router has given us a lot of APIs to create flexible ways for building our data. Have you started to dig in and migrate your app yet? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to make sure that your site remains pixel perfect as you're migrating over to the App Router, check out my video where we learn how to use visual testing with Applitools. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.